They built an entire neighborhood on my land, and I let them finish. The smell of fresh asphalt hit me before I even stepped out of my truck, thick and chemical, baking under the Texas sun like something that didn't belong here. And the sound came next, a constant low growl of generators and nail guns echoing across what used to be open pasture. My pasture, 47 acres. My father walked every morning with a cup of black coffee and a quiet kind of pride you don't see much anymore. And now there were sidewalks, street signs, identical beige houses lined up. Like they'd been stamped out of a mold, 196 of them. I counted twice, because I needed to be sure I wasn't losing my mind. Because standing there on the edge of the property line, boots sinking slightly into gravel that hadn't existed a year ago, I could still remember exactly where the old fence used to run, exactly where the oak tree stood before it got cleared out like it never mattered. And what got me wasn't just the construction, it was the people, families already moving in, kids riding bikes down streets that cut straight through land my grandfather bought in 1958 for less than $10 an acre, land that had never once been for sale, not to anyone, not ever. And yet here it was, packaged, landscaped, and sold off like it had always belonged to them. Like I was the one trespassing. I could hear laughter drifting from one of the backyards, the sharp hiss of a sprinkler system kicking on, water arcing through the air in perfect symmetry, and I remember thinking how clean it all looked, how finished, how final, like whatever had happened here was already decided. And that's when she pulled up, Margaret Whitmore, white BMW, sunglasses, clipboard resting on her lap, like she was inspecting something she owned. She didn't even look surprised to see me standing there, just gave me that tight, polite smile people use when they've already made up their mind about you. Can I help you? She asked, like I was some contractor who'd wandered off schedule, and I tasted dust at the back of my throat before I answered. Because there's a moment when you realize the rules have already been bent, maybe even broken, and nobody's planning to fix them, and I could have said it right there, could have told her exactly who I was, could have pulled out the documents sitting in a folder on my passenger seat, the original deed, the survey maps, the federal filings my grandfather had the foresight to secure decades ago. But I didn't. I just stood there, listening to the hum of a neighborhood that shouldn't exist, watching her check a box on that clipboard like I was just another minor issue to be handled. And I nodded once, slow, controlled, the way you do when you've already made a decision nobody else knows about yet. Because what she didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that I wasn't there to argue. I wasn't there to stop construction. I wasn't even there to warn them. I was there to see how far they'd go, how much they'd build, how deep they'd dig themselves in. Because the truth doesn't need to shout, and it definitely doesn't need to rush. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is stay quiet and let them finish everything. I was not supposed to come back to that land alone. At least that is what my sister kept telling me over the phone, her voice thin and distant from California, like she was talking about a place that only existed on paper, but I could still feel it under my boots, still remember the way the gravel used to crunch before they paved it over, still remember the smell of cut grass in late summer, and the way my father used to stand at the fence line every Sunday morning, hands on his hips, scanning the horizon like he was guarding something invisible, something worth protecting. And maybe he was, because that land was never just dirt to us. It was time. It was sweat. It was every hour he spent fixing irrigation lines under a blazing August sun while I handed him tools I could barely lift. And when he passed, that responsibility did not disappear. It shifted, quietly, onto me, along with a stack of documents I did not fully understand back then. Thick folders filled with maps, permits, and signatures that looked older than the county itself. And I remember him saying one thing very clearly. Keep every piece of paper, son, because one day someone is going to pretend this was never yours. And standing there now, staring at street signs that had replaced his fence posts, I realized exactly what he meant, because this was not some random development. This was deliberate, coordinated, planned down to the inch. And the more I looked, the more details started lining up in a way that did not feel accidental. The drainage slopes matched the old survey lines. The main road cut straight through what used to be our access path. Even the retention pond sat exactly where our low field used to collect runoff every spring. Which meant one thing. They had my land data. They had my layouts. They had access to information that should never have left my family's records. And that cold realization settled in my chest heavier than anything else. Because this was not just about someone taking advantage of an empty property. This was about someone who knew exactly what they were doing and expected nobody to challenge it. And maybe they were right. Because for a long time, nobody did. The tax notices had been redirected. Through a management company my sister hired, the zoning classification had quietly shifted while I was overseas working contract infrastructure projects, and every small change, every filing, every approval had been processed just clean enough to avoid raising alarms. Like a slow leak you do not notice until the foundation cracks, and I missed it. I will own that. I trusted the system to flag something this big, something this obvious, but systems do not protect people who are not paying attention, and by the time I stepped back onto that property, the transformation was already complete. Houses sold, families settled, lawns trimmed to exact height requirements, and an entire homeowners association enforcing rules on land they did not legally own. And that is when I stopped thinking like a homeowner and started thinking like an engineer. Because I have spent years in places where infrastructure either holds or collapses based on details nobody else sees. And what I saw here was not stability. It was pressure building under a perfect surface, pressure that only needed the right point, the right document, the right moment to release everything at once. So I went back to my truck, opened the passenger door, and pulled out the folder I had almost handed over earlier. The edges worn, the paper slightly yellowed, and for the first time since I arrived, I allowed myself a small, controlled smile, because they thought this story ended when the last house was built. But for me, it was just getting started. I did not go home that night, not right away. Instead, I drove straight to the county records office the next morning, the kind of place that smells like old paper and dust, where fluorescent lights hum overhead and nobody looks up unless you make noise. And I like places like that, because truth does not hide well in rooms built to store it. I signed in, kept my voice low, and asked for every filing tied to my parcel number over the last 5 years. And the clerk, a guy in his 60s with reading glasses hanging halfway down his nose, gave me a look that said he had seen this kind of situation before, not surprised, just tired, like he already knew how it would end for someone. And when he slid the stack of documents across the counter, I could feel the weight of it in my hands, thicker than it should have been, heavier than any normal set of updates. And that was the first confirmation I needed, because land does not change this much without leaving fingerprints. And as I flipped through page after page, the pattern started to emerge. Zoning reclassification filed 6 months after I left the state, signed off under an expedited review clause, development permits approved in record time, environmental impact assessments marked as minimal despite the fact that this land had a known drainage history going back decades. And then there it was, the name that kept repeating like a signature stamped across everything, Whitmore Development Group, tied directly to the same last name as the woman with the clipboard. And that small detail told me everything about how this had been done, not fast and sloppy, but slow and intentional, layered just enough to look legitimate unless someone knew exactly where to look. And I kept going, because surface level was never enough, not in my line of work, not when infrastructure and legality intersect. And then I found the document that almost made me laugh, a declaration of presumed abandonment, filed with supporting statements claiming the land had been unused and unmaintained for years, backed by inspection photos taken at angles that avoided every visible marker my father had installed, every boundary stake, every irrigation line. It was clean, almost impressive in how carefully it had been constructed, like someone understood the rules well enough to bend them without breaking them outright. And that is when I realized something important. They were not counting on the law to fail. They were counting on the owner to never come back, because everything they built depended on that assumption. And the moment that assumption broke, the entire structure underneath it started to shift. I leaned back in the chair, the faint creak of old wood under my weight, and let that thought settle, because I could have challenged it right there, filed a counterclaim, stopped everything mid-process. But that would have limited the damage, kept it contained, and I was not interested in containment anymore. I was interested in exposure, in letting every layer they built become part of the evidence. So I kept digging, pulling archive plats, cross-referencing coordinates, tracing the original survey lines my grandfather signed off on. And when I laid my documents side by side with theirs, the difference was not subtle. It was absolute. Theirs was recent, convenient, optimized for approval. Mine was older, deeper, tied to federal records that predated most of the local regulations they relied on. And that difference mattered more than anything else, because local authority can be influenced, adjusted, even pressured, but federal filings, especially ones tied to land use and water rights, those do not disappear, they do not expire quietly, and they definitely do not yield to a homeowners association. And as I closed the folder and thanked the clerk, I noticed the way he nodded, just once, like he understood without asking, like he had seen enough to know that this was not over. And walking back out into the heat, the sunlight hitting harder than before, I could hear construction in the distance, steady, confident, unaware, and for the first time since I arrived, I did not feel anger. I felt clarity, because now I knew exactly what they had done, exactly how they had done it, and more importantly, exactly how it was going to end. I let 3 weeks pass before I went back to see her again, not because I needed more time, but because they did, because every day that construction continued, every closing signed, every family that moved in added weight to what was coming. And when I pulled into the neighborhood this time, it felt different, more finished, more confident, lawns trimmed in straight lines, flags hanging from porches, the soft rhythmic click of sprinkler heads sweeping across perfectly measured grass. And there was a sign at the entrance now, polished stone with engraved lettering that read Willowbrook Estates like it had always been there. Like history could be installed overnight if you had enough money and the right approvals. And I parked just outside the sales office, stepped out into air that smelled faintly of fresh mulch and new paint, and walked in without rushing. Because timing matters more than speed in situations like this. The receptionist greeted me with that rehearsed brightness that does not quite reach the eyes, and within minutes, Margaret Whitmore appeared from a back office. Same controlled smile, same posture like she owned every inch of ground beneath us. And this time she recognized me immediately, not as a threat, but as an inconvenience that had not taken the hint the first time. You again, she said, her tone light but edged, and I nodded once, setting the folder down on the polished desk between us, not opening it. Not yet, just letting it sit there like something she could not ignore. And for a moment, her eyes flicked to it, quick, instinctive, the kind of glance people make when they are checking for something they hope is not there. And then she leaned back slightly, regaining that practiced confidence. If you are here about the same claim, I can assure you everything has been reviewed and approved at the county level, she said, each word precise, rehearsed, and technically correct in a way that sounded convincing to anyone who did not know better, and I let a small silence stretch between us, long enough for the faint hum of the air conditioning to fill the room, long enough for her to start wondering why I was not reacting the way she expected, because people like her rely on confrontation. They expect anger, raised voices, emotional arguments they can dismiss or redirect, but I gave her none of that. I just looked around the office, at the framed permits on the wall, the development maps, the glossy brochures showing smiling families standing on land that did not belong to them. And then I spoke, calm, even. You built fast, I said, and something about that shifted her expression, just slightly, because it was not an accusation, it was an observation, and she nodded, almost proudly. We believe in efficiency, she replied, and I almost smiled at that. Because efficiency without foundation is just acceleration toward a problem, and she had no idea how true that was. I reached out, tapped the folder once with my fingers, not opening it, not giving her what she wanted yet. You sold most of them already, I added, and this time her chin lifted a fraction, confidence returning. All but 12, she said, and there it was, the number, the scale, the exposure, everything I needed confirmed without asking directly. And I nodded again, slow, deliberate, letting that information settle into place like another piece of a structure I was building in my head. And then I picked up the folder, not leaving it behind, not revealing anything, just taking it with me as I turned toward the door. And I could feel her watching me now, not dismissive anymore, not entirely comfortable either, because uncertainty is louder than any argument. And just before I stepped outside, I paused, glanced back once, and said quietly, "You should have checked the original records." And then I left her standing there in a room full of approvals that were about to mean a lot less than she thought. Because the strongest structures are not the ones that look perfect on the surface, they are the ones built on truth, and everything she had built was resting on something that was about to shift. I did not file anything that week, or the week after, not a complaint, not a notice, not even a formal inquiry. And that was the part that started to bother them. I could tell, because people who build fast expect resistance just as quickly. They expect noise, letters, legal threats, something they can respond to, something they can manage, but silence, real silence, the kind that comes with intention, that is harder to deal with, because it means something is happening they cannot see. And while they kept selling homes and hosting weekend open houses with balloons tied to mailboxes and soft music drifting through staged living rooms, I was somewhere else entirely, sitting at my kitchen table late into the night with the hum of a single overhead light and the faint smell of coffee gone cold, spreading documents across the surface in careful rows, every survey, every permit, every filing they had submitted stacked next to what my family had held onto for decades. And the contrast was almost surgical. There's clean, recent, optimized for approval. Mine older, layered, tied into systems that did not move as easily. And that is when I started mapping it out. Not just the land, but the overlap, the points where their claims intersected with mine, where their authority ended and mine continued whether they acknowledged it or not. And those points were everywhere, running under roads, cutting through backyards, crossing utility lines they had already installed without realizing who actually controlled the ground beneath them. And the more I traced it, the clearer the structure became, not just a mistake, not just an oversight, but a network of decisions built on a single assumption that had never been verified. And I documented everything, photos, timestamps, coordinates measured down to inches. I walked the perimeter again and again, feeling the shift from gravel to concrete under my boots, listening to the hollow echo of new sidewalks where dirt used to absorb every step. And I noticed things they probably thought were invisible, slight grading inconsistencies, drainage paths that still followed the original contours no matter how much they tried to reshape them. Because land remembers, it does not forget just because someone redraws a line on a map, and neither do records that were filed long before any of this existed. And as the days passed, I could feel the weight of it building, not pressure on me, but pressure on everything they had constructed, like a structure carrying more load than it was designed for. And then the first letter came, certified, clean envelope, official tone, informing me that I was trespassing on private property and requesting that I cease all unauthorized presence within the community boundaries. And I read it twice, not because I needed to understand it, but because I wanted to appreciate the confidence behind it, the certainty that they were in control. And I set it aside without responding, because responding would acknowledge their position as something valid, and it was not in the way that mattered. And 2 days later another notice arrived, this one more direct, referencing enforcement, potential fines, language designed to push, to provoke, to force movement. And I let that one sit unopened for a full day before reading it, just to remind myself that urgency was their tool, not mine. And when I finally folded it back into the envelope, I realized something simple and absolute. They were still playing by their rules, still assuming this was a local dispute that could be handled with procedures they controlled. And that misunderstanding was the biggest advantage I had, because the truth I was holding did not operate on their timeline. It did not answer to their letters, or their committees, or their carefully structured authority. It existed outside of all of that, waiting, unchanged. And when it finally surfaced, it was not going to argue with them. It was going to replace everything they thought they had secured. And I leaned back in my chair, the quiet of the room settling around me, and allowed myself that same small, controlled smile again. Because the hardest part was not proving what was right. It was letting them believe they were right long enough for it to matter. The first official notice did not come from the HOA. It came from a law firm, heavy paper, embossed letterhead, the kind that tries to impress before you even read the words. And I could feel the difference the moment I pulled it from the mailbox. The faint stiffness of the envelope, the smell of fresh ink, everything about it designed to signal escalation. And I stood there at the end of my driveway for a second, holding it between my fingers, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog, letting that moment stretch just a little longer, because once you open something like that, the tone changes. And I wanted to be clear in my own head before I stepped into their timeline. I opened it slowly, unfolded the pages, and read through every line without rushing. They were not accusing me of anything dramatic, not directly. Instead, they were framing it carefully, referencing property boundaries, community regulations, unauthorized presence, language that stayed just inside the line of polite while still pushing hard enough to create pressure. And near the bottom, there it was, the request, cease entry, acknowledge HOA authority, or face further legal action, and I could almost hear Margaret's voice behind it. Controlled, confident, convinced that this was the step that would finally move me, that would force me to respond, to engage, to make a mistake, and I folded the letter once, clean and precise, and slid it back into the envelope. Because the most important thing in a situation like this is not reacting to the pressure, it is understanding where it is coming from. And this was not strength, this was anticipation. They were starting to feel the gap between what they believed and what they could prove, and that gap was making them uncomfortable. So they reached for something they understood, legal language, formal notices, escalation through familiar channels, but they were still operating inside their system, still assuming the boundaries of the conflict matched the boundaries they had defined, and that assumption was about to cost them everything. I set the letter down on the table next to my documents, next to the original deed that had been signed long before any of them ever set foot on that land. And for the first time, I pulled out the one file I had not needed yet, the federal record, stamped, archived, tied to water and land use agreements that extended beyond county jurisdiction, and I ran my fingers along the edge of the paper, feeling the slight texture difference, older, heavier, like it carried weight in more ways than one, because this was the part they never checked. The layer beneath everything they built their case on, and I knew the moment this entered the conversation, the rules would shift, not gradually, not in a way they could manage, but completely, because authority only works until something greater overrides it. And this was that override. I spent the rest of the afternoon organizing everything into a single sequence, every document placed in order, every reference tab marked, not for argument, not for debate, but for clarity. Because when the time came, I was not going to explain this to them. I was going to show it. Clean, undeniable, final. And as the sun started to dip lower outside the window, casting long shadows across the table, I realized something simple. They thought this letter was the beginning of the end. They thought they were tightening control, but all they had really done was confirm that they were ready to step into a space where their authority did not apply, ready to stand in a room where the only thing that mattered was what could be proven. And I closed the folder, slow and deliberate, because that room was coming, and when it did, I would not need to say much at all. I did not respond to the law firm, not immediately. Instead, I waited for the next move, because patterns matter, and people who believe they are in control rarely stop after one step. And it came exactly 5 days later, a formal notice of hearing, scheduled at the county courthouse, clean, precise, structured to look routine. Like this was just another property dispute that would be resolved with a few arguments and a signature at the end, and I could almost picture Margaret signing off on it. Confident, composed, convinced that bringing this into a courtroom would force clarity on her terms, and I remember standing in my kitchen with that notice in my hand, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall filling the silence, and for the first time, I felt the shift from preparation to execution, because this was the moment everything had been building toward. Not the letters, not the conversations, but this room they had just invited me into, a room where documentation outweighs assumption, where authority is measured in proof, not confidence. And I set the notice down next to my folder, next to the original deed and the federal records, and I ran through it all again, not because I needed to check anything, but because repetition sharpens certainty, every line, every coordinate, every signature placed exactly where it needed to be. And then I closed the folder and left it untouched for the rest of the day, because there was nothing left to prepare, nothing left to adjust, and that kind of stillness is rare. It means you are ready, whether the other side realizes it or not. The morning of the hearing arrived clear and quiet, the air cool before the heat settled in, and as I drove toward the courthouse, the roads felt familiar in a different way, not because I had taken them before, but because I understood exactly where they led. And when I stepped inside, the building carried that same atmosphere all courthouses do. Polished floors, low voices, the soft echo of footsteps moving with purpose. And I saw them before they saw me. Margaret standing with two attorneys, her posture straight, her expression composed, The same controlled confidence she had shown from the beginning. And for a moment, nothing changed, no reaction, no acknowledgement, just a glance that lingered a fraction longer than before, like she was trying to read something that was not there, and I nodded once, polite, neutral, giving her nothing to work with, because this was not about confrontation anymore. This was about timing, and we were both exactly where we needed to be, inside a system that does not care who speaks louder, only who can prove what is real. And as we were called into the room, I could feel the weight of the folder in my hand, not heavy in a physical sense, but in a way that carried years of history, decisions made long before this moment that were about to define it completely. And I took my seat, placed the folder on the table, and rested my hand on top of it without opening it. Not yet. Because the most powerful moment is not when you reveal everything. It is when you choose the exact second to do it. And as the proceedings began, voices measured, formal, controlled, I listened, not interrupting, not reacting, letting them present their case exactly as they believed it should be seen, because every word they spoke, every claim they made, was building something that was about to collapse under its own weight, and I stayed still, focused, patient, because justice does not need to rush. It just needs the right moment to step forward, and that moment was getting closer with every sentence they finished. They finished speaking like they had already won, their attorney adjusting his tie, stacking papers into a neat pile, every movement controlled and confident, and Margaret sat there beside him with that same composed expression, chin slightly raised, eyes forward, like this was just another formality before everything became official. And I could feel the room settle into that quiet pause that comes right before a decision starts to take shape. The faint hum of the air conditioning overhead, the soft shuffle of someone shifting in their seat behind us, and then the judge looked in my direction, not impatient, not dismissive, just waiting, and that was it. That was the moment I had been holding back for since the first time I stepped onto that paved-over land and smelled asphalt where grass used to grow, and I did not rush. I did not speak immediately. I simply opened the folder, slow, deliberate, the sound of paper sliding against paper cutting cleanly through the silence, and I placed the first document on the table, not pushing it forward yet, just setting it down where it could be seen, the original deed, dated decades before any of their filings existed, the ink slightly faded, but still sharp enough to carry authority, and I let it sit there for a second before sliding it across, and I watched the shift happen in real time, subtle at first. The attorney leaning forward just slightly, Margaret's eyes narrowing as she tried to process what she was looking at, because this was not something they expected, not something they had prepared for, and I followed it with the next document, the survey map. Original boundary lines marked with precision that matched every inch of the land they had built on. And then the third, the federal filing, stamped, archived, tied to land use and water rights that extended beyond county jurisdiction. And this one I did not slide immediately. I held it for a second longer, long enough for the weight of it to be felt before it even reached the table. And when I finally placed it down, the room changed, not dramatically, not loudly, but in a way that was unmistakable, like something invisible had just shifted into place, and I spoke. For the first time, my voice steady, even, carrying just enough to reach everyone without forcing it. These records predate every filing presented by the development, I said, and I could hear the clarity in my own words, not defensive, not aggressive, just factual, and I continued. The land in question was never abandoned, and it falls under federal jurisdiction due to existing water rights and land use agreements that were never disclosed or overridden, and I stopped there, because saying more would have been unnecessary. The documents were already doing the work, and I could see it now. The attorney flipping through pages faster than before, the controlled rhythm breaking, Margaret's posture tightening just enough to betray the first real sign of uncertainty, and the judge leaning forward slightly, eyes moving across the documents with a focus that had not been there earlier. And that was the difference. That was the exact point where confidence built on assumption meets proof built on fact, and it does not argue, it does not negotiate, it replaces, and I sat back slightly, hands resting on the table, not adding anything else, because there was nothing left to add. Everything that needed to be said was already there in black and white, in signatures that could not be undone, in records that did not care about timelines or approvals that came later. And as the silence stretched again, longer this time, heavier. I knew something had just shifted permanently, not just in that room, but in everything that had been built outside of it, because the truth had finally stepped forward, and it was not something they could push back. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like something settling into place after being forced out of alignment for too long, and I watched as the judge leaned back slightly, fingers resting against the edge of the documents, eyes moving once more across the deed, the survey, the federal record, and there was no rush in that movement, no hesitation either, just a steady recognition of what had already been established. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, carrying the kind of authority that does not need to be emphasized. These documents indicate prior and overriding jurisdiction, he said, and that was it. Not dramatic, not loud, but definitive in a way that cut through everything that had been presented before. And I did not look at Margaret right away. I did not need to, because I could feel the shift beside me. The controlled confidence from earlier replaced by something tighter, something quieter, the realization setting in piece by piece. Not as a single moment, but as a sequence of understanding that could not be stopped once it began, and her attorney tried to respond. I could hear the change in his tone, less certain, more careful, words chosen with more precision than before, but it did not matter, because the foundation of their argument had already been removed, and everything built on top of it was starting to lose shape, and I sat there, still, hands resting lightly on the table, not adding anything, not interrupting, because this was no longer about presenting my side. It was about watching theirs come apart under its own weight, and after a few more exchanges, brief, procedural, the decision came into focus, not as a dramatic declaration, but as a series of acknowledgments, filings to be reviewed, permits to be suspended, ownership to be re-examined under the correct jurisdiction, and each one landed exactly where it needed to, not all at once, but in a sequence that made the outcome clear long before it was formally stated. And when the session concluded, the room did not erupt. There was no sudden reaction, just the quiet sound of papers being gathered, chairs shifting, people standing up with a different energy than they had when they sat down, and I closed the folder, the same slow, deliberate motion I had used from the beginning. And for the first time, I looked directly at Margaret, and she was not smiling anymore, not controlled, not composed, just still, processing, standing in the space between what she thought she had built and what was actually real. And I gave her a small nod, not out of victory, not out of acknowledgement, but because there was nothing else to say. And as I stepped out of the courthouse, the air felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just clear, like something unresolved had finally been brought into the open. And later that week, I drove back to the property, the same entrance, the same polished sign, the same rows of houses. But the feeling had changed, subtle, but undeniable. Because now every street, every driveway, every structure stood on ground that had been defined again, correctly, and I stepped out, boots meeting concrete that still held the faint warmth of the afternoon sun, and I looked out across it all, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with a quiet understanding of how it had unfolded, because they did not lose when I spoke, they lost long before that. The moment they assumed no one would ever come back, the moment they built everything on, something they never truly owned, and I stood there for a second longer, letting the silence settle, before turning back toward my truck, because in the end, justice does not arrive with noise or spectacle, it arrives with clarity, steady, patient, and inevitable.